Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining me. I'm Charles Tomlinson, Senior Finance Editor at SmartStream, and today we'll be talking about the shift to a T+1 settlement cycle and what that means for corporate actions. Joining me is Adam Cottingham, Head of Asset Servicing at SmartStream. Adam, it's great to have you.
Hey.
So let's get right into it. The shift to a T+1 settlement cycle is already underway. So what kind of changes will this shift mean for corporate actions?
Iron, which has been driven by a number of key players in the US settlement process, has been driving the initiative to a T+1 settlement process. Other markets could follow suit, but this is focused on the US market. There is a clear push to reducing counterparty and settlement risk and reducing margin requirements. This is important in a time of high volatility. The markets have been stressed since the pandemic, and we've seen this before. But in an industry designed to run on T+2 settlement or longer, the consequences of accelerating this process will have an impact on other aspects of a firm's operations. Whilst the link between the settlement process and the corporate actions operation isn't immediately obvious, it is apparent. These consequences can be categorized as compression, there'll be changes in market practice, and there'll be wider impacts on systems and infrastructure.
You know, Adam, you mentioned compression. How do you define compression here, and what does that mean in practice?
By moving to a T+1 settlement cycle, many operations will in fact have to run twice as fast. And so by de facto, manual processes will have half the time to run, and batch processes will be stressed or be required to be made redundant. Corporate actions teams will experience operational compression and infrastructure compression. Event processing velocity impacts the notification process, the position capture and management process, other lifecycle processes, but importantly, the entitlement calculation process. And this can also have an impact on accounting. When organizations rely on custodian data, this data is already processed in a batch cycle and has latency applied to it. Processing this information manually will not allow an operation to catch up with the requirements of processing in a T+1 cycle. Position capture run in batch will further cause operational compression relating to the eligibility defined by critical dates, and a lack of timeliness relating to entitlement calculation will cause stress to the accounting record and cause errors. Both mandatory and voluntary events will be impacted, and the changes to the static data out of these events will also have a downstream impact on securities processing and matching. Prime brokerage, in supporting a number of firms, will experience this compression across all of its individual clients, and securities lending practices will also experience this type of compression. In a market where corporate actions operations volumes are increasing, there are seasonal peaks, and there are well understood risks that are hard to mitigate, then compression is a very important thing that it's important that we address how to alleviate this pressure and the way it would build up in a movement towards T+1.
So obviously it sounds like individual firms are going to have to revamp their internal processes. But how are wider market practices going to change with T+1?
DTCC, SIFMA, and ICI have published a number of papers, and these papers clearly state a number of recommendations. So the first recommendation, which is clear, is that there needs to be an alignment between the X date and the record date to simplify the process of eligibility for new positions. in a compressed situation. There is also a recommendation to eliminate the cover protect period and make it redundant. These items will create procedural change, and there is a recommendation to address this at appropriate costs. And so this is directed importantly by the use of market standards across counterparties and to create what is stated as a uniform corporate action process. This would be enabled by the adoption of SWIFT, directly related, but also, more importantly, the ISO standards that SWIFT process, and that's 15022 and 20022 across the complete event lifecycle. And done correctly, this will also mean applying the Securities Market Practice Group standards and the National Market Practice Group deviations, where these US deviations would be called out. A clear progression towards achieving automation across the event lifecycle is being identified.
As markets evolve, system changes are inevitable, but can this transition be seen as an opportunity in the corporate action space?
Well, firstly, it's important to see the T+1 change in the context of today's world, and specifically their corporate actions operations. So if you look at when CSDR is driving forward settlement discipline, this initiative follows suit. And when it's not adhered to, it carries a heavy cost. So it's important that system change enables that, and corporate action has a part to play, as we've previously stated. And for a corporate action operation, today, many processes in the majority of firms are run manually. For those firms that have semi-automated processes, often they are driven by batch processes, also creating latency. This is particularly important for the position management and entitlement processing. Investment in systems is required to be able to alleviate the compression of manual processes and batch processes. If T+1 processing is introduced, then the processing window for an event will be compressed, but also the processing window for correcting mistakes associated with misprocessing will also be reduced. The only way to address this, if you don't undertake systematic change, is to increase operational overhead. So systems that can achieve STP with the appropriate operational controls are required. These systems should, yes, be 15022 and 20022 aligned, SWIFT enabled, and aligned with market practice guidelines. And yes, they should be real time for a minimum of position management and entitlement processing. There is an opportunity to change. Doing so under an appropriate cost will be the challenge for most firms when looking how to apply T+1 settlement for the US market, but also enable peripheral processes.
Now, let's say I'm a broker or a bank or an asset manager. What steps should I be taking right now to manage this change?
T+1 is targeted for Q1 2024. To reduce compression and risks associated with that for corporate action processing, but also T+1 settlement, firms should not wait. A 2-year test period is being initiated, and our recommendation is to get involved. Respond to the call for action. Also, undertake an internal risk assessment and plot a path to follow the working group's recommendations and best practices. Find a way of achieving operational timeliness with resources that you have at your disposal. For those that choose to adopt a real-time systematic change, they could also find that the cost of reducing their corporate action operation and infrastructure would reduce. Most importantly, they would find that they would be able to significantly reduce their risk of misprocessing events as well as not meeting the timeliness constraints of T+1.
Great. Well, that's all the time we have for today. Thanks again, Adam, for joining us, and we really appreciate your insight.
Thank you.